Police officers take an oath to protect and serve communities all over the world. They put their lives on the line every day to make sure citizens are safe, and more often than not, they're regarded as heroes. In some cases, however, law enforcement officers are committing crimes, and those crimes are being covered up by those in power. Corruption is often swept under the rug, but in these 5 cases, it was exposed. Number 5. On December 2, 1975, the Montgomery, Alabama Sheriff's Office received a call reporting a robbery at a local grocery store. The caller stated that an African-American male wearing a red ski cap, blue jacket, and jeans had just demanded money from the clerk and fled the store on foot. Officer Daniel B. Foster was dispatched to the case. Upon arriving, he spotted 32-year-old Bernard Whitehurst, who immediately began to run when he spotted the patrol car. Whitehurst, who was wearing a brown and white jacket and brown fedora, was repeatedly told to stop, and when he continued to flee, Foster began chasing him. Over the next 30 minutes, more officers arrived to aid in the apprehension of Whitehurst. It was alleged that Whitehurst then fired a gun, prompting Foster to shoot Whitehurst twice in the chest. The injuries were fatal, and Whitehurst died behind an abandoned house. An autopsy was never performed. The medical examiner based his report on the statements given by officers on the scene, noting the cause of death to be gunshot wounds to the chest. Police were familiar with Whitehurst, yet his family was never notified of his death, and his body was embalmed. Conflicting statements given by the officers who witnessed the shooting raised questions about the events. Some officers reported that they never saw a gun in Whitehurst's possession, while others claimed that the weapon was just a few feet from his hand when they approached his body. A civilian claimed that they heard an officer yell to Foster that he'd shot the wrong man. Despite Montgomery County insisting that it was an open and shut case, District Attorney James Evans had doubts. 6 months after Whitehurst was buried, Evans demanded the body be exhumed in order to perform an autopsy. During the examination, it was discovered that Whitehurst had been shot in the back, not the chest as originally reported. Over the next several months, it was found that radio logs associated with the shooting had been deleted, and the gun Whitehurst allegedly had in his possession was planted. 3 police officers were ultimately indicted for their involvement in Whitehurst's death. Only one case was presented to the jury, and this resulted in a mistrial. Attorney General William Baxley proposed that no additional charges be filed in the case if those suspected of corruption took and passed a polygraph test. Officers and officials who refused to take the test were forced to resign. Instead of taking the polygraph, the 3 officers suspected of perjury resigned. 5 more officers followed and chose to abandon their careers in law enforcement as well. The mayor, who passed his polygraph, as well as the director of public safety, also resigned. Despite evidence that could have led to a conviction in the murder of Donald Whitehurst, no one was ever held accountable. Number 4. On July 27, 2014, Desmond Logan began training at the Chattanooga Police Department in Tennessee. 6 months later, he was patrolling the streets. In 2015, while on duty, Logan picked up a woman who was walking to a relative's house and told her she was under arrest. Instead of taking her to the police station, he drove her to a deserted parking lot. He forced the woman into the back seat of his patrol vehicle and sexually assaulted her. The victim immediately called the sheriff's department and reported the incident and was directed to a local rape crisis center where she was examined. The detailed report of allegations against Logan was entered into Chattanooga's internal police department system, Blue Team, but it was later removed. With an outstanding reputation, Logan was then hired by the University of Chattanooga that summer. With no knowledge of the assault, Logan was assigned to patrol events on the college campus. On January 2, 2016, Logan asked a woman for a ride to his patrol car after one of these events. Instead of leading her to his vehicle, Logan directed her to an empty parking lot. He then pulled out his stun gun, using it on her leg, and demanded that she engage in sexual acts before exiting the vehicle. The incident was reported to the university and he was fired, but the police department was never notified. On June 11, 2018, a woman was arrested by Logan and transported to the Hamilton County Jail. While being booked, she explained that before Logan brought her in, he drove her to an empty parking lot and raped her. Her story was dismissed at first, and it wasn't until 3 days later that she was transported to a nearby medical center to be examined. Police Chief David Roddy held a press conference on June 16th to inform the public that an officer is being investigated for sexual misconduct. He claimed that the most recent incident was the only allegation against him, even though reports had been filed dating back to 2015. An anonymous officer came forward after the press conference and stated that Roddy was unaware of any incidents before June of 2018 because Assistant Chief Edwin McPherson and Captain Pedro Bacon deliberately concealed that information. A second officer came forward and said that Logan's history of sexual misconduct was well known within the police department, but no action was ever taken. During the investigation, emails were discovered between McPherson and Bacon detailing their involvement in protecting Logan. Logan was arrested and took a plea deal in federal court on September of 2019. He pled guilty to 2 deprivation of rights charges that have a maximum prison sentence of 10 years each. Because sexual assault isn't typically a federal crime, it will be up to the state of Tennessee to prosecute him for the actual acts if they choose to do so. Logan was scheduled for a sentencing hearing in February of 2020, but no further information has been released. McPherson and Bacon currently are being investigated for their role in the cover-up. Number 3. Devon Miller was just 19 years old on December 28, 2016. In the early morning hours, he says he and his 2 friends were walking through a Whitby neighborhood when they were confronted by off-duty police officer Michael Thorold and his brother Christian Thorold. The brothers began to question why the teens were in the area, and when Miller and his friends walked away, the brothers chased them, leading to a brutal attack. Michael and Christian claimed that they confronted the teens after catching them breaking into their father's truck, and they were only trying to apprehend them. Devontae was chased by the brothers into an area between 2 homes. Michael allegedly hit him with a steel pipe before beating him so severely that his left eye would later have to be removed. A witness, Toronto Fire Chief Jim Silverthorne, heard a commotion outside of his bedroom window and saw Michael and Christian attacking Miller. By the time Silverthorne made it downstairs, Miller had broken free momentarily and was banging on his front door for help. Silverthorne saw Michael force Miller to the ground, and he called 911 to report the incident. The 911 dispatcher informed him that the young man had just been caught breaking into a vehicle and that officers were already en route responding to a call Michael had placed just minutes before. They dismissed his concern that the incident was getting out of hand. Officers arrived at the scene and arrested Miller for theft, possession of marijuana, and assault with a weapon stemming from allegations that Miller was the one who brandished the pipe. He was transported to the hospital to assess his injuries. He suffered from multiple fractures in his nose and eye socket and spent months recovering. Michael and Christian claimed they were acting in self-defense, but Toronto police failed to notify the civilian watchdog, which investigates police involved in injuries and fatalities. It wasn't until months later that they were contacted by Miller's attorney requesting a review of the case. Because there are 2 very different accounts regarding the events leading up to Devontae's injuries, the case was taken to trial. In January of 2020, an Oshawa court heard closing arguments and has set a date for April to determine if the brothers are guilty of aggravated assault and obstruction of justice. Number 2. Just before 10 p.m. on October 20th, 2014, Chicago police received a call to investigate a young man who was carrying a knife, slashing tires, and breaking into vehicles. 2 officers arrived at the scene and witnessed Laquan McDonald acting erratically, still holding the knife in his hand. The officers were not equipped with tasers, so they pulled their vehicles in front of McDonald to prevent him from fleeing the scene and requested assistance from an officer with a taser. McDonald then proceeded to puncture the tires of one of the patrol vehicles before walking away. McDonald was told repeatedly by officers to drop the knife, which he refused to do, and he was still holding it when Officer Jason Van Dyke arrived on the scene. Within seconds, Van Dyke shot McDonald, and after the first bullet was fired, 15 more followed as McDonald lay motionless on the ground. Initial reports stated that the action taken by Van Dyke was within guidelines of the department's use of force because the officer was in fear for his life due to McDonald threatening him with a weapon. The death was ruled a justifiable homicide. Dashcam footage was released to the public that did not correlate with what the officers on scene reported. McDonald never raised the knife to threaten Van Dyke, and he was walking away from the officer when the first shot was fired. Inspector General Joseph Ferguson looked into the incident and found that up to 16 members of law enforcement say they may have been involved in an attempt to cover up McDonald's murder. 2 officers at the scene made statements that they heard Van Dyke tell McDonald to drop his weapon before shooting him, but it was later discovered that they would not have been able to hear this request from where they were standing. Additionally, 4 officers had failed to follow police department regulations regarding their in-vehicle video and audio systems. The Chicago Police Department attempted to blame the lack of dashcam footage from these vehicles on the patrol cars facing the opposite direction or technical problems initially, but it was discovered that there was evidence of tampering and deliberate dismantle later on. A lieutenant was at the scene the night McDonald was shot and improperly discarded witness statements and went on to fabricate police reports. While under investigation for misconduct, he chose to retire. Ferguson recommended that 11 officers be fired as a result of this investigation. This included Deputy Sheriff David McNaughton and Chief of Detectives Eugene Roy, who approved false police reports after viewing the contradictory dashcam footage. Both men also retired before facing punishment. 4 officers who witnessed Van Dyke shoot McDonald were terminated for obstruction of justice and making false statements. They were, however, not held legally responsible for their involvement. On October 5, 2018, Van Dyke was found guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. He was sentenced to 6.75 years in prison. Number 1. The Rampart Division of the LAPD serves the communities west of Los Angeles. In the late 70s and 80s, there was a dramatic increase in violent crime in these areas. Chief Daryl Gates formed a special unit called Crash to combat this issue by infiltrating local gangs. Officers assigned to work for the Crash unit modeled their appearance and mannerisms after gang members to gain the trust of criminals, but some took it too far. Officers not only participated in the theft of money and drugs on the street, but also murdered innocent people. In one instance, a man named Jose Saldana was shot and killed in an apartment building hallway. Crash officers planted a gun at the scene and left the man to bleed to death, claiming that the murder was in self-defense. Officers were recruited to the Crash unit and initiated by team members. The new members were tested for loyalty by being forced to plant evidence and were shadowed by an experienced member at all times to ensure that they didn't report the activity. The corruption within the Crash unit wasn't a secret though. While many members wanted to be transferred out of the unit due to the behavior, some officers at the precinct wanted to be transferred in to partake in the illegal activities. Because the Los Angeles Police Department was seeing a decline in violent crime since Crash was organized, little was done to remedy the situation. In August of 1998, Officer Rafael Perez was arrested for stealing 8 pounds of cocaine from an evidence locker. To avoid the lengthy prison sentence, he took a plea deal, which shed light on more than 70 officers, including supervisors, who either committed corrupt acts or knew what Crash was doing and allowed it to happen. Only 24 officers were determined to have committed any sort of crime. Half of them were given suspensions, 7 officers were forced to resign, and only 5 were terminated. Perez was sentenced to 5 years in prison for stealing the cocaine, which he planned to sell on the street after replacing the contents of the evidence locker with Bisquick. The Rampart Scandal goes much deeper than what is described on the surface and plays a big role in why the LAPD has a less than favorable reputation. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.